There's always a saint out there that you can turn to intercede for you.
In some places and in some cultures, we've almost replaced God with the saints. And, you know, people get nervous about that, and rightly so.
Sainthood is there for all of us. We're all called to be saints, and we will all be saints if we die in Christ.
Saints are found in many of the world's greatest religions, but most often they're associated with Catholicism, and most of us have heard of at least a handful of them. St. Francis of Assisi, St. Christopher, Mother Teresa, and then of course there's St. Valentine, the saint of love, who's celebrated widely in the Western world, and paradoxically on the date of his rather grisly death.
Saints are people whose lives we want to emulate on one level. So just as we have sports heroes, and when those sports heroes get involved with school kids, they inspire school kids to be more engaged in sports, even if the school kids are never going to become sports heroes themselves. It's great. In the same way, saints have that activity in the church. Their lives, their stories inspire us to be more than ourselves.
In the Catholic Church, they are set apart, venerated, and a vital part of the faith, both for inspiration and intercession. But what many don't realize is that, in fact, every Christian has the potential to be a saint.
When we speak in the creed of the community of saints, we aren't just a community of the living, but we are a community of the living and the dead.
So what makes a person a saint? Do they have to be a martyr or perform miracles? What are the criteria used by the Church to decide if someone is worthy of sainthood?
What really makes a person a saint is the choice, the decision, the resolve to be overtly an instrument of God, and to make those decisions on any given situation at any given time in their lives, and to be able to be witnesses. And I think that's important, to be able to be witnesses to a point where even others see something, encounter something of God in the person or through the person.
They stand out, they do something different. They have a distinctive voice. These are the ones, at least, who are canonized. They engage in something heroic to do with the faith, whether it's deep asceticism and piety in their personal prayer lives, simplicity of life, embracing poverty, great social work. Mother Teresa, classic example, Francis of Assisi, people like that, who are out there working with the poor, those who pursue justice.
Amen.
And what makes a saint, most important, especially when after somebody has died, it's what I call the staying power. So it's one thing to be a good person, like every other good person dies every week. But what is it that makes people always go back to that particular person?
Today, the idea of saints might seem a little outdated to some, a kind of relic of medieval times. But many in the church, both the clergy and ordinary people, say saints are as relevant to us today as they were in years gone by.
Well, I mean, in one level, religion is completely irrelevant to the world today. We live in a world of technology and everything is instant gratification, and religion takes a broader view, a longer view, and a deeper view, a view what might call the view of the eternal. And I think that would be my initial reaction to this question of relevance. But if we want to use the language of relevance, I would say yes, indeed. There is, I think, a shortage of good, holy people in the world, quite often, at least how we perceive it. And certainly the people who get the kind of public spectacle are frequently celebrities without substance, politicians without principles, then public figures who have feet of clay. So what I think the relevance of saints today is, it's simply the fact that these are people who have chosen to live a good and holy life.
I think saints are a great way of inspiring us and giving us a way of inspiring other people about what it is to lead the Christian life. And what I love about saints is that we can draw on saints from centuries past, but also saints much more recently, and see that the life of the Church is not just in one place or in one time, but across all places and all times.
They're relevant because more and more in our times, there's a need, an urgent need for that kind of bravery, that kind of heroism, and that kind of social justice that is so lacking right now. We look at our country, our continent, even the world, and you ask yourself, when you see all these sad stories and all these disappointing absence of morals in the world, and always that image that there is in the human person the ability to say, I choose good.
I choose good. On the face of it, that seems like a simple choice, but it's not an easy one. And it's a choice that often leads ordinary people into extraordinary circumstances. Take Benedict Daswa, for example, a schoolteacher in rural Limpopo. In 1989 and 1990, his village and the surrounding areas were plagued by lightning and heavy rains. The village elders decided that the storms were the result of witchcraft and demanded a tax from all the residents. The tax was to pay for a sangoma to identify the witch responsible. But Daswa disagreed. He said the storms were just a natural phenomenon and refused to have any part in the witch hunt.
Blessed Chimangadzo Samuel Benedict Daswa Mata. Chimangadzo Samuel Benedict Daswa was born on 16 June 1946 at Mbaye village near Thohoyandou, South Africa. Baptized in 1963 by Father Augustine O'Brien MSc, he qualified as a teacher and later became a school principal. As a married man with 8 children, he was very involved in both church and community activities. On February 2, 1990, he was bludgeoned to death for refusing to take part in anti-Catholic practices of witchcraft.
Yeah, I was at the beatification of Benedict Daswa, and I think if one reads Daswa's life, he was an inspiring man. What impressed me most with Benedict Daswa was his simplicity and the little stories from his life. You see, I think the difficulty is that very often when we talk about saints or holy people, we're looking for big things, you know, that sort of seem to wow the world.
I mean, clearly he was a devout man, a holy man, very committed to the faith, very strong about the whole question of witchcraft, whatever you understand that to be, and was prepared to die for what he believed in. And so in that sense, an example of strong Christian faith in a time of adversity. Now, of course, a lot of other things were happening at the same time. I mean, there's always the question in South Africa in the 80s and continuing of the question of how we use the language of witchcraft in relation to broader social and political questions. And I think the church recognized that despite whatever the kind of broader political issues were, that there was something about this guy that made him a holy man, a good holy man, who was prepared, you know, with all his faults, to stand up for what he believed in and to reject this idea of participating in this smelling out, I think it was called, of so-called witches which usually meant people politically unfavourable to the majority of us who were doing the smelling out.
Here we've got an African man living in a rural setting, and it's reported that he used to wash the dishes after a family meal. Now, protocol often demands that the woman do that. Why was he different? And I think that's very symbolic of him being someone who was of service. He spent many, many years really dedicated to teaching the faith in an area that was difficult. We know that his death he was martyred because he stood up for his faith. And so I think, people like Benedict Daswa are important. They're important because they are, so to speak, sons of the soil or daughters of the soil. But it's the simple things that Daswa did that indicate to us the depth of this man's spirituality and the depths of this man's faith.
Benedict Daswa will be South Africa's first saint. Archbishop Denis Hurley may well be its second, although the process is only just beginning in this case. Raymond Perrier explains what the next steps are.
Marking out his grave as a shrine is the first step that Cardinal Napier took a year ago to begin the process of encouraging devotions. And what the Cardinal has said is when it's clear that there is enough level of popular devotion, then he or his successor would open the cause. So opening the cause doesn't make somebody a saint by any means, but it says it's worth investigating, it's worth exploring. And then there's a whole process of investigating the person's life and their writings and identifying miracles that have been achieved because of their intercession. And it could take 5 years, as in the case of John Paul II, or it could take 50 years, or it could take 100 years. But I think St. Denis of Durban sounds rather good, so we hope that it's going to happen maybe sooner rather than later.
Denis Hurley was a significant figure in the struggle against apartheid and fiercely opposed the apartheid regime for 50 years. As chair of the South African Catholic Bishops' Conference in 1951, he drafted the first of the groundbreaking pastoral letters in which the bishops denounced apartheid as blasphemy and intrinsically evil.
What I find fascinating and inspiring about the idea of Hurley as a saint is that in many ways he's a bridge from an old-style view of the church to the modern church. In his attitude towards other Christians of other traditions, working with people of other faiths, and seeing the church as a church of the poor, a church which reaches out to those most in need. The Denis Hurley Centre therefore continues that legacy by being a place where Christians of different denominations and indeed people of all faiths come together to work for the poor.
But why are people like Benedict Daswa and Denis Hurley singled out to become official named saints of the Catholic Church?
Blessed Benedict, with the victory of martyrdom.
Why are they given particular positions of veneration, rather than joining the communion of saints as all other Christians do?
Clearly it started in the very, very earliest church. The disciples of Jesus, the new converts that they made, growing up in a very sort of hostile environment, an environment that was basically indifferent, more than hostile most of the time. And these folks lived out good and holy lives. Many of them suffered for their faith. Many of them were martyred. In fact, almost, I think, all of the apostles we care to think of were martyred.
These early saints became heroes of the faith to the Christians that remained. Their memories were continued through oral tradition and later written down. They were preachers and teachers and doers of good works, all in the name of Christ. And so, ultimately, they became known as saints and were upheld as examples of what it means to be a good Christian.
In the early church, there was a tradition, for example, where people were acknowledged as saints by acclamation after their deaths. People would say, Patricia was a saint, and she became St. Patricia of whatever little town it was. George was a saint and became a saint of that particular place. Of course, what then happened in the church was that there were saints who were being declared based upon legends. So there were stories that were being told about holy people, which were initially told as stories to illustrate what it was to be a good Christian person, though this was purely fictional. So St. Christopher, for example.
Saint Christopher is one of the saints that even non-Catholics have heard of. He's venerated by many as a martyr from the 3rd or 4th century, but it seems he's entirely made up. The most famous legend about St. Christopher is that he carried a child across a river before the child revealed himself to be Jesus Christ. So today, even though he's fictional, he's the patron saint of travelers, and many Catholics wear his image on necklaces and bracelets or display pictures of him in their cars for traveling protection.
Which is why, as time moved on, the Church developed a more formal process of what we call canonization in the Latin Rite, in the Western Church, in Catholicism in particular. And that emerges through a whole process where they have to look into the person's life, see if they did anything that was really outrageously bad, that could be seen as a kind of mark against their holiness. And then, after a lot of careful observation, reflection, a long process in many cases, they would be recognized as saints by the Church.
And yet, while saints hold this very exalted position in the Church, their appeal is often the fact that they are also very human. Many priests and lay people find inspiration and comfort in learning about the lives of the saints. Fr Russell Pollitt, a Jesuit priest, says he's gained a great deal of insight from studying the life and work of St. Ignatius of Loyola, who founded the Jesuit order.
It was his practicality. I mean, I think Ignatius was a very practical saint, and it seemed to me the more about him that I read, the more I thought to myself, this guy kind of fits like a glove. I understand this stuff. He makes sort of living a spiritual life possible for me, which I'd never experienced before. I kind of always thought, well, you've got to belong to another realm. And somehow Ignatius said, no, in your ordinary life where you are, that's where, you have to live the spiritual life.
My particular saint, of course, I'm named after a Saint Lawrence, who was a deacon and a martyr, a very early saint. But later on in my life, I took on, after having read about Saint Maximilian Kolbe, Polish priest, Franciscan, moved by his witness, the terrible horrors of World War II. He's in Auschwitz, arrested, of course, for the work that he's been doing. And there, the usual routine people will sort of be called up, take 10 people that morning and they would be executed, killed. And when one morning they chose this man who wept, and said, no, I've got a family, I've got children, I can't die. And Maximilian Kolbe comes up and says, you know what, I'm a Catholic priest, I don't have children, I can take his place.
Maximilian Kolbe was canonized as a saint by Pope John Paul II on the 10th of October 1982, and present at the ceremony was the Auschwitz prisoner Kolbe had saved. The prisoner would live for another 54 years.
That for me is a living modern-day saint, a saint for social justice, of which I'm very passionate about.
Saints are not only held up as examples of what it means to walk in the faith or to live a good and holy life. They're also a fundamental part of many people's prayer life, a practice referred to as veneration. And veneration is often misunderstood by those outside the faith.
Often you hear people say, Father, will you pray for me? You say to a friend, I'm going to church, oh, please do pray for so-and-so. Human beings have that kind of relationship and that kind of spiritual power to be able to offer prayers for each other. And that relationship doesn't end by virtue of death.
I always think of saints as being like friends or older brothers. So I have a very close devotion to St. Anthony of Padua, and my grandmother did, and my middle name is Anthony. So when I talk to St. Anthony, I feel like I'm talking to an uncle. He happens to have lived 800 years ago in Italy. We've not met yet. I hope we might in heaven. But I can chat to St. Anthony. I can talk to him about my problems, about my worries. He's very good at finding lost things, so that really helps because I'm always losing things. But it's a conversation. And then I say, oh, by the way, Anthony, I need your help with something. Would you pray for me for this? Would you help me out with that? And it feels like having somebody's got your back. That's to me what a saint is.
In essence, they're a kind of helper, there to lean on for support or take your prayers to God.
I was chatting with a colleague who happens to be a Methodist minister who also works in Ignatian spirituality, and he used a lovely phrase. He often says when he's directing someone through the exercises, he says he's conscious that it's him and the person and the Holy Spirit, and Ignatius is another person in the room, and he leans into Ignatius's wisdom. And I think there's something, when I think about saints like Ignatius of Loyola, Teresa d'Avila, John of the Cross, or Francis of Assisi, or even Francis Xavier, I have that sense as a director that I'm often leaning into their wisdom. And what do I mean by that? Not a kind of pietistic sense, but a leaning into their writings, the wisdom that they've imparted to the church, that I'm very conscious often of them as the other in the room when I do the work that I do.
But behind every single one of these men and women, you will always find a humanness, and you will always find a struggle with God, a struggle with relationships, and very often a very nice sense of humor as well in their struggle. I think in some ways they talk to you in your struggle, but they also talk to you at times when maybe you're experiencing yourself a more connectedness with God, and their mystical spirituality draws you in to that same sort of mysticism.
This mysticism isn't reserved for people who've reached a particular level of holiness. It's not just for priests and spiritual sages. Many ordinary Catholics pray to the saints about all kinds of matters, and many say their prayers are answered in miraculous ways. Delia Kairuz and Lauretta Fagri are two such ordinary Catholics with extraordinary stories to tell.
Whatever your problems are in life, whether it be work or whether it be family or whether it be for a child, for a baby that you want to conceive, there's always a saint out there that you can turn to intercede for you. And I stress the word intercede because it's not that they're going to give it to you, but they're going to take it to Jesus, they're going to take it to God and say, please help her with X, Y, and Z, and it's answered abundantly.
My story starts in 1984. I was 21 years old and I was on dialysis, and a dear old lady came to visit my grandparents, and she said to my grandparents, give this to Loretta's mother. Can I show you the novena? This is the actual novena that she gave to my parents. Give this novena of Saint Rita, and she will answer your prayers. Through her intercession, she'll answer your prayers. So my mother started the novena, and she said it diligently, and on the 9th day they phoned me and they said to me, please come in, there's a kidney for you. And I had only been on dialysis for 6 months, and my mother was so excited. She said, I'm on the 9th day of my novena, I know it's going to be answered. I said, Ma, they call up 8 people and only 2 are going to get the kidney, and there've been people that have been on dialysis for years. I don't think I'm going to get it. Anyway, as it happened, they came and took me off dialysis, and they said, you're one of the 2 that got the kidney. Our whole family was convinced that she heard our prayers, and through her our prayers were answered. So that was the start of my devotion to Saint Rita.
I know a lot of people find the novenas very helpful. And like all prayer, I mean, what are we doing when we pray? Are we manipulating God? Because that's called magic. That's witchcraft. By doing certain actions, doing certain words, we will get certain things.
St. Jude in particular, he's the saint of impossible cases. And my mother particularly had a devotion to him. quick incident of what happened to her. She battled to have children in those days, and there was a big gap of 5.5 years between me and my sister, Celeste. And she couldn't have, the doctor said after me, definitely no more children. She had a growth on her ovaries and she had to have a hysterectomy, and she said, no, one more child and then I'll have it. And he said, you'll never be able to. She went home and she prayed to St. Jude and she made him a promise. And she said to him, if I have one more child, if you bless me with one more child, I'll name it Jude if it's a boy and Judy if it's a girl. And 3 months later, she fell pregnant with my sister. And the doctors couldn't believe it, said it was a miracle which had happened. And she gave birth to my sister Celeste, and she's Celeste Judy today.
Prayer, properly understood, is opening ourselves to God's presence and to place our particular concerns and needs before God. And so if a novena, 9 days of praying a certain set of prayers with the intercession of a particular saint, helps you to get closer to God, that's fantastic. If on the other hand, you think of it as some kind of means whereby you will get things, my cancer will clear up in 9 days if I do my novena, I get worried, because I think that's an attempt to manipulate God. And I don't think God finds that terribly impressive. I think he looks at us probably and goes, oh dear, they're at it again.
Saint Teresa, whatever you ask of her, she'll answer you with a rose or a flower to say that your prayers will be answered, and she's done that often with me. All the novenas to the saints are 9 days of continuous prayer. And after the 9 days, or within the period of the 9 days, you will either be given a flower or a rose to say your prayers are being heard and will be answered. And it's always happened to me whenever I pray to her. 3 days, 4 days into the novena, my roses or my flowers are presented to me.
I think we must think of doing another one this year again, going to I fell pregnant with Kelly after my second transplant, and the doctors didn't want me to have her. They wanted me to terminate the pregnancy, but I refused. It's against my religion, and if anything, God will take this baby away if it's not meant to be. But I continued with the pregnancy, and I had the most wonderful pregnancy with Cal. And after 38 weeks, this perfectly beautiful, normal little baby popped out. And Cal and I we're best of friends, we're soulmates. So I'm so grateful that I never listened to the doctors, and I trusted in God, and all my prayers to Saint Rita and Our Lady, and they were all answered.
Often the way a novena is phrased illustrates, I think, something about it. Usually with a novena, you pray for some particular intention, that my Aunt Agatha's corns will get better. There's always an added thing, but if that's not really what she needs, God give her what she needs. And I think that's slightly healthier. At least it recognizes that it's not a case of, if I say these prayers, I'm going to get Auntie Agatha's corns healed.
Part of the veneration of saints involves the use of relics. These are preserved body parts or personal effects of particular saints, which are safeguarded and handed down over the centuries.
Relics, I admit, a strange thing, particularly strange to people who don't grow up with them. So there's this whole notion of different types of relics, what they call degrees of relics. So a first-degree relic is part of the saint's body. A second-degree relic is something that they used or wore in their own lifetime. A third-degree relic, which is really kind of really low rent, is anything which has touched the body.
Like all of us in our human lives have pictures of those who are dear to us. You know, we go to people's houses and we visit people's houses and we see images of mothers and fathers and children and grandchildren and so forth. And they remind us of something. They remind us of our connectedness. They remind us of our family ties. It's the same with the saints. The church puts these people before us to remind us of these people and their holy lives, to inspire us. You know, these are our examples. And often when I visited people when I was working in a parish, I would go to people's houses and you would see all these pictures, and I would say to them, well, tell me about, who's this? And they'd say, well, this was my great uncle, or this was my great grandfather. And they tell you a story about them. And I think it's the same thing with the saints. That's what the church is saying. These are people who are dear to our family as God's people. And they are people who remind us of who we are, our core identity. They invite us onto the same journey, although different is what they've made. And they are people who hopefully inspire us to be the best that we can be within the midst of our daily lives and our struggle.
Relics are curious, the idea that we treat a physical object as being holy. So, for example, I mentioned St. Anthony of Padua. When his body was disinterred, when the shrine was created in Padua, his whole body had decomposed except for his tongue. And his tongue was still intact, and Anthony was known as a great orator. It's one of the reasons I'm very drawn to him. And his tongue, if you go to Padua, the beautiful shrine in Padua, you can see his tongue 800 years after he died, which is still looks like a tongue. It looks like a slightly shriveled prune. So I guess the notion is that you see his tongue and you think, oh yes, I'm inspired to be a great orator the way Anthony was. Not quite sure that really works anymore. I think we just feel a bit icky at the thought of that.
We are symbolic beings. We like symbolism. Those physical things remind us of something. And so I think relics is the same idea in the church, that these are the remains of this man or this woman who are meaningful in the Christian community and remind us of the lives that they lived and what we're called to do.
Like any practice, one goes back to how it started. What was the culture at that time? And you begin to see, like, similarly, like in traditional healers that use bones, they use bones and relics to be able to discern something and to be able to look at why in that particular cultural context were the bodies of people, or what were the experiences at that time of these relics, what was the context, and what made it so significant to the church that it became part of the faith.
There is a tradition that every altar in every church should have either a first or a second degree relic. And there's a very good reason for that. The very earliest formal altars that we know of were below the streets of Rome, in the tunnels underneath Rome, in what we call the catacombs. And the catacombs were places where people were buried. So what the early Christians would do during the times of the persecutions would gather around the grave of somebody whom they venerated, who'd been martyred, and they would hold their service there, their Eucharistic service, using the grave as an altar. So literally, of course, the body was in the altar because it was the tomb. And so that's why the tradition continues, that there's always a first or second degree relic in every altar. And that's why, for example, in the Catholic Church, at the beginning and the end of the service, the priest bows and kisses the altar as an act of veneration to the martyr or the saint whose relic is there.
The Lord be with you.
They become like symbols that point us to God, because all the power is from God. It is God who needs to be at the center of our lives, that everything else needs to support, and that nothing should be transformed into magic.
There are people in the church who unfortunately have tried to remove these men and women who are meant to be examples to us of holiness, have tried to remove them almost from the human sphere. And when we do that, we start to sort of build a superstitious way of looking at them. And I think we get into a realm there of the unreal. And this is not in the mind of the church. I think when we start to project our own insecurities sometimes onto these people, or our own dogmatic ways of thinking, which are not necessarily the same as the church's way of thinking, that's when we land up in all sorts of problems.
A belief tied into the idea of relics is that of incorruptibility. This is the belief that somehow God allows some human bodies to avoid the normal process of decomposition after death. This is seen as a sign of the dead person's holiness, and if a body is judged as incorruptible, it's generally taken as a sign that the individual is a saint. Not every saint, however, is expected to have an incorruptible corpse.
I remember, going to Rome and, witnessing some of those bodies that are incorruptible. And as much as I try to understand every single thing, there's some things that, when you actually see and you see the body is incorruptible, that you almost, your only response will be just awe, that there are some mysteries that are there. And again, that mystery can be a symbol that your faith, in the sense that our bodies in the next world will be incorruptible. So there's a symbolism there that is very rich. And then again, for us not to worship that body, but to worship the one who made it incorruptible, and that is God. Always to see all these things in their sacramentality, that they are signs that are pointing us to the one.
But in a country like South Africa, where the spread of Christianity has a somewhat checkered past, how do we reconcile the idea of these seemingly very Western saints with African culture and traditional beliefs? Dr. Hadebe says there are many parallels to be drawn.
So it's very similar, and then they are venerated. They are not worshipped, they are respected, they are consulted. People pray to different saints. People have favorite saints, so that, there is a connection with them. And so it's believed that saints go to heaven, and so they are in the presence of God. And so therefore, if people consult them, then it's much easier for them to take the prayers to God. So it's very similar to African understanding of the ancestors.
African culture holds ancestors with high regard. There is a place reserved for people who have lived and died. That death in African culture absolutely does not mark any finality in any way. African culture also holds that the relationships that we shared when we were alive are not abrogated by death. Your mother doesn't stop loving you now that she's dead. In fact, the very same interest that she had about your life, about your children, she continues to have. And because of that, African culture always took ancestors on board, because it's a relationship.
But before actually getting into that understanding, it's important to look at the African worldview, which is very much similar to Christian worldview, in the sense that there's a belief in the spiritual realm, the natural realm, and the underworld. And then there's also a belief that life continues after death. So when somebody dies and has lived an exemplary life, and according to that understanding of exemplary life, you're talking about somebody who maintained, who lived out Ubuntu, who lived out the traditions of the culture in a way in which the people around him were able to really understand what it means to be a person who is faithful to the tradition.
I remember when I was going to study in London, for instance, my father, we're preparing for my departure, and my father saying, we have to let, the living dead know that you're not around for some time. Let's go to the grave, let's go to your grandmother's, because I was very close to my grandmother. And so African culture has this relationship. It can be muddied, to be honest with you. I know that sometimes some people have what I call a very exalted, very, 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 very exalted view of the ancestors, in such a way that it is unclear whether they refer to them as gods.
As we know, African culture is not written down, it's oral. So it depends on people passing it from one generation to another. So when an individual lives in a community and embodies those values of Ubuntu and respect and veneration for the ancestors, then when they die, we believe that that person will go into the spiritual realm. Because in all African societies or in traditional religions, God dwells in the spiritual realm. So if you want to communicate with God, you need to be in the spiritual realm.
I think the idea of the communion of saints, on the one hand, which is kind of coming out of the West and out of the Christian tradition, this idea of all those who've gone before me, all those who've died, if you like, one's household saints, you know, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, and the people before them, the ones who passed down the faith, is very similar in many ways to the idea of ancestors. And I can always remember John Mary Waligo, who is an African theologian, talking about Jesus as being the ultimate ancestor. You know, Jesus is finally the ancestor to whom we all look as Christians. And that was a lovely image for me. I found it very powerful.
But in the Zulu culture, there's always been in existence Umveli Nqangi, the God, the creator of everything. That has always been in the hierarchy of beings, as it were, in the cosmology of beings, as it were. Umveli Nqangi, the God who created everything. And then there's this band of ancestors, according to their tribal or family links. And because of that, the links are so glaring, aren't they, between the Christian faith, and that in fact I find that the strength of evangelization, at least in Christian life today, when you're working in very rural places, there's some pockets of the Christian faith who say there's no such thing. But you know, that's not the teaching, at least of the Catholic Church.
We do an exercise in a program that my colleague Puleng developed, where as we're teaching, if we're teaching Lectio Divina in a township context, we might use the beginning of Matthew, where you've got the begats, you know, so-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so. And it's an amazing experience because you watch people for whom ancestors are important read through that list of Jesus' ancestors, and the penny drops. Ancestors were important to Jesus too. His ancestry is important. My ancestry is important. This is part of God's unfolding salvific plan.
So we have this idea of saints interceding for the faithful in heaven, where they're close to God. They are elevated beings, singled out as being holy by virtue of the lives they've led. And that's all very well and good, but Father Russell Pollitt emphasizes that we should never forget about the saints all around us right here on earth.
We have official saints and we have a calendar of saints in the church. But we mustn't be fooled by that. That's important and that's symbolic. But we also all know men and women who are holy people. Often you visit a parish, whether it's in an urban area or a rural area, and there's always 3 or 4 or 5 people who are dedicated to the service of that local community. They get up in the mornings, they open the church, they clean the church, they ensure that things are ready for people to come to church. Very often people who go out and visit the poor, who visit the sick, who in little ways are trying to make a difference. And these people are holy men and women as well.
I think it's really important that the list of saints, the canon of saints, continues to develop and continues to broaden. We have an awful lot of saints of European origin. We have an awful lot of saints who perhaps follow a particular model of sanctity. It's interesting that women who become saints are usually referred to as virgins or martyrs, as if those are the only options available. It's only in very recent years that married women, that women who are mothers, women who worked outside the home have been held up and venerated as saints who are not themselves nuns. And I think it's important that we do that, because otherwise we keep holiness locked away in very particular compartments.
I heard a fantastic story probably about 18 months ago on the radio one morning of an old lady who was living on a SASSA pension in a very poor area of Johannesburg. And every day she was using this pension to make a pot of soup for local children who were unable to find food anywhere else. And so out of the little that she had, every day, Monday to Sunday, here she was, a bit of bread and a bit of soup for the local people on a very meager Sassa pension. That woman's a saint. That woman, that's her life. And I think those are the kind of unsung heroes that we can miss when we simply just look to a calendar.
Whether in heaven with God or here on earth walking amongst us, it seems that saints have one common purpose: to point Christians to God and allow them to have a closer walk with Him. Those who've gone before inspire with the holy lives they've led. Those encountered every day on earth in ordinary life inspire with their example in the present moment, and often in the smallest of ways. Those qualities transcend geography. They are not limited to Western thinking or Eurocentricity. They are relevant to Catholics both in South Africa and in Africa as a whole.
I'd love to see Africans realizing that they were real people in Africa, and that the faith, although it sometimes has the trappings of Europe, of Europeanness, the faith is very much African. We've been in this as early as the 1st century, and that the lives of the saints are proof. Perpetua and Felicity, Augustine, all these, Bakita, Africans. The goal is to show what the Lord has been doing in and through the human person, and to show what the Lord is still doing in and through us.
And so we have to identify in our own lives, in the communities where we come from, those people who are examples and those people who live holy lives, because they also, like the saints, are our windows to God. They remind us of God's presence, they point us to God, and they call us to living a holy life as well.
To the Venerable Servant of God, Tsimangatso Samuel Benedict Daswa.
And perhaps this is what those inside the Catholic Church would most like those outside of it to understand: that saints are venerated, not worshipped; that their role is to inspire and to intercede, but ultimately, their greatest purpose is to be both a bridge and a signpost, connecting and directing ordinary Christians to the God they worship.